Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome, everybody. So glad that you're here. Sorry about the mix-up with the Zoom link. Glad that you all found it. And if you didn't and you're watching this later, I'm sorry that you couldn't watch it in the moment. We're so glad that you're here, and we have a wonderful program in store for you today. My name is Sarah Bunin Benor, and I'm the founder and director of the HUC Jewish Language Project. And we do research and education about Jewish languages around the world. You might be wondering why we are running a webinar like this. And the answer is because so much of the research that we do in language helps us to understand history. And we realize that there's a parallel phenomenon happening in research on genetics. And so we decided to organize this panel along with the other panel that goes along with it, which is next month in March 15th at the same time. And we are going to, in that panel, learn about how genetics is connected to linguistic and onomastic research. That means research about languages and names. And so I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy learning from our wonderful panelists today. Our panelists are Flora Cassen, the Levine Family Director of the Brandeis Center for Jewish Studies and Director of the Sarnat Sarnat Center for the Study of Anti-Jewishness at Brandeis University, and Josh Lipson, co-president of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation and clinical psychologist, and Leo Cooper, also co-president of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, an associate at Reich Lab at Harvard University, and a director at Open Genomes. So we are going to ask our panelists to start by telling us what historical questions they're trying to answer and how they use genetics to help answer them. We're going to start with Flora and then go to Leo and Josh, and they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation within the whole panel, responding to each other's presentations and answering some questions, and then eventually we will have time for audience Q&A. So I now turn it over to Flora Cassen.
Hi, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me. So I come at this from a historian's perspective. I don't have, training in genetics or biology. But when I started studying and I, did my PhD in medieval and early modern European Jewish history, I very quickly realized there was a puzzle, and I was surprised that it actually was a puzzle. And that is the fact that we don't quite entirely know where Ashkenazi Jews come from. And I was surprised to learn that, because you think, oh, Ashkenazi Jews, it's one of the large uh, cultural Jewish groups that exist today. Of course, we know they all come from Eastern Europe. But the question is before that, and if you think about it, it's one of the more recent cultural Jewish groups. It may be 1,000 years old. And in some ways, we actually know the least about the origins of Ashkenazi Jews. And that was very surprising to me. And, you can compare to Sephardic Jews, the other, European Jewish cultural group. There's kind of a more or less unbroken link from between the end of the Roman Empire to the expulsion in the 15th century. We know that Jews live there. But if you look at Northwestern Europe and then Eastern Europe, there's kind of a several centuries break at the end, between the end of the Roman Empire and around the 11th century, when small Jewish communities start to appear in Northwestern Europe, say Eastern France and Western Germany. Suddenly we see in the historical records, small Jewish communities appear in the Rhineland. Oftentimes they're invited, but we don't fully know where they came from. Now, in some of the writings, they left us, one of the sort of intellectual groups that lives in Germany, the Hasidei Ashkenaz, they say we came from Italy. And before that, we lived in Babylonia, and we're bringing all the knowledge from the great rabbis of Babylonia. We're the ones who brought it to Europe. And so that's the story they tell themselves. It aligns with the sort of broader story Jews have told themselves for centuries, right? That we all, at some point, our ancestors lived in the Middle East and then dispersed all over the world. But we don't quite know if that is actually true or not, or how that happened and when. And then between the 11th and the 15th century, progressively more groups from France, Germany, Italy, and so on slowly moved to Eastern Europe, oftentimes because of persecution and expulsions, sometimes because the opportunities were just better in Eastern Europe. And then it's in Eastern Europe that, they develop Yiddish and Ashkenazi Jewish culture, the food and the theater and the literature and everything we know. But for me, the question was that puzzle of the origins that was surprising, and for which we just did not have more information in the text, right? The stuff historians usually use to answer these historical questions. And early on, whenever I heard of genetic studies of Ashkenazi Jewry, from my perspective, they only added to the puzzle because they didn't correspond to the information I had from text, right? For example, there's that study that was reported in the newspaper in 2014 by Itzik Pe'er at Columbia. And he said, yes, so all of Ashkenazi Jews derive their origins from a small group of 350 Jews 600 to 800 years ago. But I thought to myself, who are they? Where do they come from? Are they already in Eastern Europe? Or are they coming from Germany after the Crusades? But then what happened to all the Jews who moved later that we know about? And when they arrive in Eastern Europe, and do they become part of that Ashkenazi Jewish group? Right? From me, from a historian's perspective, that only added to the puzzle. It didn't resolve it because the information we have in censuses. And I wrote an article that appeared about a year ago in JQR where I kind of explain where I'm coming from. And I say, the information we have from census and population numbers in Eastern Europe doesn't really correspond to that. The information we have about migration from Western Europe doesn't really correspond to that. So it was kind of difficult for me to understand. And that changed in 2022 When a first study was published, I think by Selina Brace and her group, and it was about a well in Norwich, in England, in which a group of bodies had been found accidentally. They were, I think, digging a garage for a mole. And they did genetic studies on those bodies and found that they most likely were Jewish because they had Ashkenazi characteristics in their genes. And so that was fascinating, and for the first time offered a perspective that maybe aligned better with the historical perspective. Although for anyone who thinks Ashkenazi Jews appear in Eastern Europe in the right 15th, 16th century, suddenly we're talking about a group of Jews before 1140 in England, right, the westernmost side of Europe. So that completely sort of changed that perspective. But for the first time for me, it aligned with the historical documentation that I knew about. And then a second study that appeared a little later by David Rice group at Harvard and Shai Karmi in Jerusalem that talked about a cemetery in Erfurt in the 14th century, in which they again had done genetic analysis and realized that, in fact, that cemetery in Germany in the 14th century displayed wide variety of genetic backgrounds, right? You knew it was a Jewish cemetery, but some of the genes were more similar to Turkey, some were more similar to Eastern European Jews, some were more similar to Southern and Middle Eastern Jews. So that displayed actually a surprising variety of origins. And again, I think this to me again jived better with what I knew because it suggested different groups arriving at different times, not a kind of static population history for 1,000 years or or more. And in trying to understand that, I, for the first time, tried to read some scientific material. I read David Rice's book, Who We Are and Where We Come From, where he's explaining, and I realized that actually something had happened in 2012 that I didn't know about because I was a historian, but that for the first time, scientists had started analyzing DNA material from the past. And that until now, all the DNA studies were based on populations alive in the present and then inferred back, right? And so people who call themselves Ashkenazi today were studied, and then based on their genetic material, information was inferred back about the past. But this is really, in a way, opposite to what historians usually do, right? We start from the past. We don't start from the present, right? Methodologically, that's how we have to operate if we want to be serious historians. We have to go to the people in the past, find their writings, find their information about them, their bodies, anything we can find to try to understand their lives. And so I realized that a really important shift happened that potentially opened the door for the first time to using those scientific advances to do historical work that is consistent with the historical methodologies that we use. And to me, that was very exciting. So I'm kind of waiting for more studies to be done about European Jews, see what's coming out. And I'm hoping for much closer collaborations between historians and scientists moving forward, because obviously I don't have the scientific knowledge, but I have knowledge about, right, the history and the historical documentation, and also how historians understand, right, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Say, what we tell ourselves about who we are in the present, about what it means to be Jewish or Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi or whatever it is, isn't necessarily what people said about themselves in the past, right? And that's the problem with starting from the present. And so to have that exchange in which I think people who study genetics would, understand better how we approach those stories, and we, getting into the science a little bit more and trying to understand how we can use that science to understand the history of Ashkenazi Jews. I think, potentially we could, I don't know, fully solve, but certainly much better understand one of the sort of big puzzles that exist today about the history of Ashkenazi Jews. So I'll stop here and look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. We now turn to Leo Cooper. And there we go.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you, Flora, for that discussion. I think that grounds us really well. Um, just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Awesome. So off of that, I'm going to propose and discuss some ways that we can use genetics to solve mysteries in Jewish history. And this is work that I do as a part of my nonprofit foundation, the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, which I lead with Josh Lipson. So my questions for this topic and in our work uh, involve how Jewish populations, both those that exist today and historical ones, are related to each other. And alongside that, how Jewish culture impacts how Jewish populations and their genetics evolve over time. So these are going to be the questions that I'll return to and that will bound the scope of my discussion now. One big idea that I'd like to attempt to communicate to you all is the idea that Jewish culture and Jewish genetics evolve side by side. Historically speaking, Jewish communities tended to have really small population sizes. The sizes of historical Jewish congregations were small. And considering the fact that only so many people of the congregation end up being parents to children who then go on to be the next generation of that community, the small size can have a big impact. This impact of the small size is exacerbated or extended through the tradition of endogamy. That is to say, just marrying within the Jewish community that one found oneself in, and ends up creating what is cousin marriage. Whether or not it's close cousins, it's still people who are related to each other who are continuously marrying within their group. These factors combine with the boom and bust settlement cycle, which is characteristic of Jewish diasporic settlement around the world. There's opportunity that is taken advantage of, and then there are expulsions after that opportunity dries up. And this cycle repeats on and on again. And through these processes and the traits of these populations, what ends up forming are unique descent networks, really specific ways that culture and genes end up being defined in a certain group. And I'll state these in a slightly different way. For all human groups, culture and genes, the repertoires of those, they evolve together, step by step, side by side, as embodied by living individuals, our living ancestors. Now, the particulars of Jewish life tends to drive down the number of distinct cultural and genetic ancestors. This is a theoretical implication of the model of Jewish population history I'm discussing here. And from that, we infer that Jewish communities can lose diversity through this process, and also this process increases the power of randomness in how their cultures and genes change over time. basically it's the process of how small populations can create distinction. Now, when we're talking about combining historical and cultural evidences with genetic evidences, it's important to understand that there are really multiple kinds of each of these. So some analogs for culture, we've got names, we've got language, we've got rights in the Jewish context, nusach. We've got dress, what are people wearing? Cuisine, what are people eating? Occupations, what are people doing to make a living? You know, these are threads of cultural history and cultural folkways. And in the same way, different there exist different kinds or types of genetic evidences and analyses. So I'm going to briefly survey some of these here. In general, with genetics, there's two kinds of markers that we're looking at. And there's no actual fine line between the two. These are alleles and haplotypes, but it's informative to think of them as distinct. Alleles refer to the A's, the C's, the G's, the T's, the single letters, the single rungs of the ladder of DNA in our genomes. Meanwhile, haplotypes are long stretches of these rungs or these letters, which form blocks. And population geneticists have developed different ways to leverage these different genetic markers to infer different kinds of demographic processes. One common type of analysis employed is a statistical method called principal component analysis. This attempts to maximize the amount of variation in the fewest possible dimensions. And we use a PCA, it creates a kind of plot or graph to visualize genetic gradients, how individuals and populations are different from each other in genetic space. Now, an alternative analysis looks at runs of homozygosity. This looks at, for an individual, on pairs of chromosomes. For example, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. If I wanted to look at chromosome 11, I have two copies. And what runs of homozygosity look at are identical stretches of DNA, that is to say haplotypes, that are shared on both sides of my chromosome 11 or on all of my chromosomes. What this shows is the legacy of consanguinity, which is just another word for endogamy or marrying within the group. The legacy of this in populations. And ROH is one way we measure this. Identity by descent, or IBD segment sharing, is closely related to runs of homozygosity. This is the kind of analysis that's employed on genetic testing platforms where you can see your cousin matches. What this looks for are stretches of DNA that are shared between your cousins, and it implies recent shared ancestors. Meanwhile, uniparental markers, that is to say the Y chromosome and mitochondria, are also haplotypes, but they're not recombined like runs of homozygosity or identity by descent, IBD segment sharing. Those ones, every generation, they're going to mix and match as new chromosomes are formed. Meanwhile, these uniparental markers are special because they are inherited linearly. They trace paternal lines in the case of the Y chromosome and maternal lines in the case of the mitochondria. Now, genetic disorders are common in many Jewish populations. And here, in this kind of context, genetic disorders imply moments in population history where natural selection was ineffective. It was unable to weed out these bad genetic variants from the population. And that can be informative for population history. Finally, there's two programs that I've included here. One uses allele correlation to infer ancestry, as in like percentages of a individual's full genome as belonging to certain ancestral components. Meanwhile, that's structure. Meanwhile, Ascend is a different program which uses allele correlation to infer founding events. That is to say, when moments when populations descend from few genetic ancestors. Now, when we're trying to weave together these multiple threads, to make a complete history, we need to consider all of these on their own, all of these types of analyses, and in combination with each other. And only through that process do we actually find novel insight. Now, I want to show, in the case of Georgian Jews, how these very genetic evidences actually come out. So on a PCA plot, which I'll show in the next slide, a distinct Georgian Jewish cluster separates very early. And I'll explain what separates early means as well in the next slide. With ROH, we can tell that Georgian Jews have elevated rates that are consistent with long-term endogamy for that population. Additionally, based on statistics of IBD segment sharing, we can infer that they've been a small population for a long time, and or they've only recently expanded into their present-day size. With uniparental markers, we can recapitulate those same ideas. Likewise, with genetic disorders, we already know that there are multiple genetic disorders that are specific to Georgian Jews, and we can infer that those must have become stuck in the population at a certain time. Likewise, with structure, just like with PCA, Georgian Jews are able to be distinguished from other Mizrahi Jews very quickly. And again, I'll explain more on the next slide. Now, the Ascend program, that again looks for moments in the population history when there were few ancestors that the modern population descends from. This program applied to Georgian Jews inferred a really strong founder event around 16 generations ago. And I think this lines up really well with a suggestive hint about Georgian Jewish history. There's a town, Echeltziche, that potentially represents an important, perhaps preeminent ancestral community for all Georgian Jews today. And that the late medieval, early modern community at Echeltziche could represent the cultural and genetic ancestors of most Georgian Jews. Now, here are those two plots. This is a pair of PCA plots. The top one contains Mizrahi Jews and some Near Eastern non-Jewish populations. And then the bottom one is a PCA plot that only shows Mizrahi Jews. And the main takeaway here is that Georgian Jews are distinct enough on a population level that in these PCAs, they are the only group that is pulled away from the main cline and in their own direction. That is to say, like they are like these separate clusters. This corresponds to Georgian Jews. Likewise, in structure, which is attempts to infer these like ancestral components belonging to populations in successive runs of structure, where more and more components are allowed to exist. That's implied by the higher k, increasing k number. Georgian Jews are the first Mizrahi group to get their own cluster, and it remains that way as more clusters are added. And we can also see, using the PCA and this structure plot, that there are Jews in Georgia that are not like most Jews in Georgia. They came recently from other places, but that the orange component shown on the left graph corresponds to individuals who are actually of this specific, distinct Georgian Jewish community. Now, I'd like to discuss some of the research that my foundation is doing. So we have this past year sponsored several dozen Y chromosome tests for individuals from non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities. And of these several dozen, 55 have been completed. You can see these results on our website with this link. Now, using our results, I found that a vast majority of our samples from a wide range of Jewish communities join Jewish-specific networks, that is to say, paternal line sharing networks, that are younger than the existence of Judaism. And most of these date to antique and medieval common ancestors. And this Y-DNA variation is usually structured really strongly along geographic and cultural lines. This means that members of the same community will often cluster together in the same lineages, and that regional groups like Western Jews, Jews from the Mediterranean and Europe, and Eastern Jews, that is to say Jews from the Middle East, tend to form their own regional networks. It's rare to find lineages, Y chromosomal lineages, that link Western Jews and Eastern Jews. And when there is a link, most often it's actually due to a shared Judean root. And Josh will speak more on this topic. In some cases, we identified contexts where it's likely in the historical period, perhaps in antiquity or the medieval period, a Jew from the East migrated to the West and had descendants there. So when I'm saying Eastern Jews, I'm referring to modern communities which are distinct in their own right and descend from certain historical, antique, and medieval communities which represent their common ancestors. And so I'm including Aramaic-speaking Jews, that is to say Kurdish Jews, Iraqi Jews, Persian and Afghani Jews, Bukharian Jews, Mountain Jews, and Georgian Jews. Again, each of those communities and even internal to those communities might have important distinctions, but all of these groups descend from antique and medieval Near Eastern Jewish communities, and that's something that they share. I'm going to share two examples of lineages that we have added tests to that imply this. This H lineage is a Levite lineage, and it's found in Iraqi Jews, multiple Persian Jewish groups, Bukharian Jews, and Afghani Jews. And we can see that they share common ancestors in the high to late medieval period, the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s. This pattern is mirrored in this other distinct lineage, which actually happens to have a Cohen tradition at its root level, also descending from common ancestors who lived in the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, and today are found among Jews as far away as Dagestan and Afghanistan, as well as multiple Persian Jewish groups. What these imply is that these different Mizrahi groups descend from common ancestors who lived in a certain Jewish community and in a certain time, and that these legacies are not shared by other Jews from around the world. Meanwhile, when I speak to Western Jews, I'm referring to Moroccan and Algerian Jews, Tunisian and Libyan Jews, Italian Jews, Romaniote Jews, Eastern Sephardic Jews, that is to say, Jews with Sephardic roots from the former Ottoman Empire, and Ashkenazi Jews. All of these groups are on their own, distinct in some important ways, but also share antique and medieval era common ancestors. This lineage is just one of many examples of lineages that connect these populations. I am sharing it here because it connects with something that Flora mentioned, this site of medieval Jewish bones from England. Is labeled here with this shovel symbol, Chapel Field 696. This is an ancient or historical Jew from 12th century England. And a sample, it's right next to a sample that our foundation sponsored from a Moroccan Jew. And they connect to a common ancestor who lived in or around the 9th century. So these populations are really closely linked, and they descend from antique and medieval era common ancestors. So I'd like to briefly review the main takeaways, I hope, that are communicated. The small scale of historical Jewish life influences how cultural and genetic factors evolve over time. This process tends to yield distinctive signatures, which align with continuities in the transmission of culture and genetics from Jewish ancestors. And finally, that we can use these distinctive signatures to infer how Jewish populations are related to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Wow, for that whirlwind tour of genetic research. And now we turn it over to Josh Lipson.
Hi, I am trying to share my screen right now. Let me know
Yep, we can see it.
if great. Okay, I hope this is in the right mode. Taking a moment. Okay, hi everybody. Um, so I am going to continue in the vein of my friend and uh, nonprofit co-founder Leo and hone in on a more specific topic in Jewish historical genetics. I'll preface this by saying I am a psychologist. My current academic appointment is in the field of psychology research, but my undergraduate studies were in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. And my primary interest in the study of Jewish history and Jewish genetics has always been rooted in an interest in the deep Near Eastern past. And today I'm here to present on what I'm calling a new approach to identifying threads of ancient Judean ancestry in Jewish diaspora communities. So, what I want to say as a disclaimer is that from the very beginning of Jewish population genetics research, this has always been treated either as the holy grail or the elephant in the room. The question of origins in ancient Judea, ancient Israel, is a very charged one for many reasons. And it's one that I think has stimulated a lot of motivated reasoning by people in different fields in one direction or another. But what I hope to do is using accumulated knowledge and accumulated technical acumen, try to hone in on a conservative method for actually beginning to identify what Judean ancestry in Jewish diaspora communities may look like using a historical genetic synthesis. So, in the early 2000s, when I was a kid, narrative of Near Eastern origins for Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews coalesced out of the early genetic evidence. This was the headline that was widely distributed, and it was mostly based on evidence from Y chromosomal DNA, which is part of what Leo presented on also last week. I believe Raquel Toledano shared some insights from Y chromosomal DNA. But the quality of the evidence 20 to 25 years ago was much, much poorer. And this was mostly based on the prevalence of Y chromosome haplogroups J and E across different Jewish diaspora communities. It does turn out that if you combine these two Y chromosome haplogroups, they comprise a majority of the Y chromosomal signatures in most Jewish diaspora communities, I believe. So the conclusion from this that Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews have a lot of Near Eastern ancestry wasn't entirely wrong, but the evidence that was marshaled to support it was fairly lacking by today's standards. And what I'll emphasize in the next few slides was fairly unspecific and didn't lend itself well to specific conclusions. So autosomal evidence, that is evidence from the full genome from all 23 pairs of chromosomes, has shown that Levantine-specific ancestry, while considerable in most Jewish diaspora communities, does not constitute an overwhelming majority of the ancestry in most of them, or even a majority for that matter. And we now know that top-level haplogroups like J, which often connotes Jewish in people's minds erroneously. The letter correspondence is a total coincidence. But we know that top-level haplogroups like J, E, G, R, which began to develop a reputation in pop science and pop genealogy at the turn of the century, are not ethnic-specific markers. They're actually tens of thousands of years old. They're markers of shared Ice Age ancestry in various regions, which may or may not be of interest to people who are motivated to uncover deep patterns in Jewish history. It's also important to note that if people are interested in questions of origins in ancient Judea or Israel, we need to parse apart these different designations, which have different levels of historical breadth and also different genetic correlates. Judean ancestry is more specific than Levantine ancestry, which is in turn more specific than Near Eastern ancestry. There are many different distinctive forms of Near Eastern ancestry, which are pretty readily distinguished by different forms of genetic analysis. So, the research question that I've honed in on, that Leo and other collaborators of mine have been playing around with for some years at this point, is there a better, more up-to-date way to conservatively but confidently identify some strands of Judean ancestry in diaspora Jewish communities? And so far, ancient DNA has begun to offer vague hints, but very little has been published. So the question is, can modern Jews' DNA hold the key, at least a key, provisionally for now? And my answer is, why DNA, if anything, is going to be what holds the key. So as has been covered in a few talks in this series, Y chromosomal DNA is very distinctive because it's non-recombining. It's passed directly from father to son over the generations. It mutates at a predictable rate, which allows for one, fairly precise structural or phylogenetic mapping. We can say exactly what mutations any two men's Y chromosomes share or don't share. And we have pretty robust algorithms for estimating the date of any such connections or the age of any clusters based on shared mutations. And since the mid-2000s, there's been what I call a Cambrian explosion, to harken back to deep evolutionary biology in Y DNA phylogenetics. So what was once referred to as haplogroup J1 and not really investigable beyond that, say 15 or 20 years ago, now has thousands of distinct, clearly defined subbranches that exist on a precise, almost quantum level, and whose age can usually be pretty robustly estimated. It's also worth noting that there are dozens of branches of haplogroup J1 among different Jews, and they each need to be taken on their own terms. A really good example of this, by the way, is the Cohen modal haplotype, which was originally defined by 6 low-resolution genetic markers when my collaborator, Karl Skoretsky, discovered it in 1997. This signature on the Y chromosome that seemed to unify about half of all Jewish diaspora men who identified as Kohanim. And we can now identify its exact correlate in deep Y-DNA phylogenetics and identify its exact place in the tree of all human Y chromosomes. And we actually are able to date its common ancestor to approximately the 9th century BC. And that's astonishing in many ways. I don't want to get too deep into the story of the Cohen, the primary Y-DNA signature of Kohanim, because it's too distinctive and it merits its own story. But suffice it to say, we have a publication under review focused on that that's already out as a preprint. So the method that I've developed with support from some colleagues is one that focuses on Jewish coalescences in primarily the Iron Age through classical period as a conservative signature of shared ancient ancestry between different Jewish communities. And specifically, we look for things that are likely to be indicative of shared Judean ancestry. And again, I emphasize, this is a circumstantial rather than forensic bullseye, but this is the best we have to work with right now. And so I'm going to name a few criteria that define this mini algorithm, this method for identifying shared likely Judean ancestry among Jewish communities, and as hinted at by modern Jewish genomes. So what I'm going to show you here is a fictitious example, but it's sort of the perfect case to sort of exemplify what we look for when we're looking for a phylogenetic structure that we think is indicative of shared Judean ancestry in the Jewish diaspora. So here you see that we have a branch of haplogroup J1, which is already known to be a fairly Near Eastern neighborhood in the tree of Y chromosomes, human Y chromosomes. So that's point 2 here, belongs to a clearly Near Eastern phylogenetic haplogroup or neighborhood. And the closest cousin to the Jewish branch here is found in people who identify as Arab, and they share a common ancestor with a Jewish branch around the year 2000 BC, which is, again, very robustly indicative that this Jewish branch is ultimately Near Eastern. But here's the interesting part. If you hone in even more than that, what we're interested in are branch coalescences that are almost exclusively Jewish in their downstream structure, dating to a common ancestor between the years 1200 BCE and 0, so sort of the beginning of the Common Era. And why 1200 BCE? This is widely considered to be a good conservative cutoff for the Israelite ethnogenesis, which is the closest thing to a common thread of continuity with later Jewish identity. Even though it's certainly not identical, it's the moment at which archaeology and ancient non-Israelite inscriptions and the Bible would all agree that there is an emergent group of people in the highlands of the modern Levant who would call themselves Israelites. So a branch coalescence between 1200 BC and the beginning of the Common Era, almost all of whose descendants are Jews, that spans multiple Jewish diaspora communities. And if there are any non-Jewish high-level sub-branches, that they are Near Eastern, that they're found in people who are Levantine or Arab, or maybe certain other Near Eastern groups. So this is an example structurally where we see a family split within an overwhelmingly Jewish cluster that dates, for example, here to 900 BCE, and it parts two ways. So two groups that share a common ancestor around 900 BC based on best practice molecular dating. Both of the descendant groups are overwhelmingly Jewish. And in this hypothetical case, one contains Ashkenazim and Sephardim, one contains Mizrahim and more Sephardim. And this is sort of a perfect example of a branch that we would say meets all of the criteria for a conservative signature of shared ancient Judean ancestry. But of course, many branches that we find meet most, but not all of these criteria. So I'm going to pause there. And I'll give just some real world examples here, some very brief examples. So one is a lineage called EBY8508, and it is found within a broadly Near Eastern or Levantine phylogenetic context. We don't just base that on the top level E haplogroup, but if you go back several levels, almost all of the connections to this branch are Near Eastern, Armenian, Arab, you name it, or Jewish. And it's a minority lineage among Bukharian, Yemenite, and Sephardic Kohanim. And all of these different communities, which really represent far-flung corners on opposite sides of the Jewish diaspora, to the west, to the east, to the south, share a common ancestor. Actually deleted the average here, but currently estimated to have lived around 650 BCE. There's a confidence range around that, but nevertheless, those dates all fall within the range that I designated before. And there's no non-Jewish presence here other than Hispanic individuals who connect within a medieval time scale to Syrian, Turkish, and Egyptian Jews. So this is a very clean example. Another case here is haplogroup JZS4292. It's not associated with any special status with Kohanim, with Leviim, but it's very clearly associated with a Near Eastern or Levantine phylogenetic context based on falling under the sort of classically Semitic Jewish Arab sub-branch of haplogroup J1, but also because of more recent connections that it has. And you see here in the graphic, there are two primary sub-branches to it. The one at the bottom is all Sephardic. It's found curiously in Sephardi families from all over the Sephardic diaspora, but the advanced Y chromosome sequences are found in a Turkish Jewish family, a Puerto Rican family, and an Indian Jewish family from Cochin that has a Sephardic last name that's clearly of ultimately Iberian Jewish descent. And then up here, you see a larger, bushier branch that is found in Ashkenazim and many different Sephardic communities, as well as a medieval English Jew who is found in that well in Norwich, as reported in that publication from 2022. And these two branches, despite having a very similar Western Jewish distribution, only share a common ancestry 2,500 years ago, in 500 BCE. And there are no primary non-Jewish branches here. So this is very interesting too, because many different ancient Near Eastern associated Y chromosome DNA branches are found in a range of different Near Eastern populations. Here, though, you see a Near Eastern branch whose only primary descendant branches are Jewish. And that's not a necessary criterion for uh, potential Judean ancestry, but it is suggestive, I would say. So, what are the implications here? And again, I want to be conservative. I don't want to say that we've made any definitive conclusions, but there is a robust pattern that there are a handful of dozen, I think between 2 and 3 dozen, BCE era Jewish branch coalescences, and most often they cluster in the early to mid first millennium BCE. Um, so I have to ask, what other Near Eastern populations during this period supplied ancestry to later Jewish populations, including Ashkenazim, including Yemenites, including Iraqi and Iranian Jews, but left virtually no non-Jewish descendants? And again, as a student of the ancient Near East, I can think of hypotheticals, but they all seem fairly unparsimonious, versus coming to the conclusion that these patterns are indicative of shared ancestry in the well-documented population of either monarchic period Israel and Judah between about 1000 BCE and 586 BCE, or later Jewish populations during the Persian and Hellenistic period. But I need to emphasize, and I didn't show any control cases, but most Near Eastern Y-DNA lineages that go back to the first millennium BCE or the second millennium BCE do not look like this in their structure or their modern population distribution. This is a distinctive pattern. So the likely conclusion, and it's not definitive, is that we're beginning to touch upon evidence of a shared nucleus of common ancestry in ancient Israel and Judea. And by the way, I'll just note that in our Cohen preprint, my work with Karl Skoretsky, as well as Leo, as well as some other JGDF collaborators, we found 3 or even 4 branches associated with a modern Cohen tradition, where the Cohen tradition seems to date back to a common ancestor in the first millennium BCE. So again, this pattern is especially significant when among branches that are associated with a special priestly tradition, but certainly not exclusive to it. And I'll just end on some limitations. So a very small share of known Jewish lineages, including the ones that look clearly Near Eastern in their origin, belong to this set. But I'll note this represents a floor rather than a ceiling for potential Judean ancestry, as my friend and collaborator Dolev Revivo, who is medically trained, noted. This method is very specific but not sensitive. So it can pick up on lineages that meet a bunch of criteria, but just because a Jewish lineage's coalescence date doesn't go back to the first millennium BCE, sometimes it may date to the medieval founding of a community, that does not at all rule out potential Judean origin for the lineage, unless there's other countervailing evidence, which there often is for some lineages. So lineage extinction through bottleneck events can explain why the same Judean lineage may not have left descendants in multiple communities, may have only left a descendant branch in Ashkenaz or Sepharad or Yemen, for example. And through testing under-tested communities, we expect to find more coalescences that indicate a potential shared Judean origin. And of course, what we really hope to find is confirmatory or disconfirmatory evidence by checking against ancient and classical remains in the future. But again, until we're able to do that, this represents circumstantial rather than absolute forensic biological evidence. And I'll note this is a simple algorithm with a few criteria for a checklist, as it were. We're also looking for ways to statistically formalize this method, which is currently a very simple algorithm compared to a lot of the other tools that are used in the study of Jewish historical population genetics. So with that, I'll leave it to the rest of the panel, but I appreciate you all allowing me to present on this speculative, fun, but I think ultimately very consequential method.
Thank you so much, Josh. And now I'm going to turn it back to Flora to respond to what you've heard. What does this spark in your historical mind? You're muted.
All right. Am I muted now?
Now we can hear you.
Yeah, so I think this is fascinating and very interesting. And the idea that, each and every one of our bodies contain kind of, information about where we come from and who we are in the past is extremely compelling, right? And it explains the success of what we've seen, this kind of individual genetic testing by, commercial companies in recent years, 23andMe and so on, that right have made millions because I think it's a human need that we want to know where we come from and who we are. And if we can find, pieces of that in our own bodies that tell us really who we are, I think it's fascinating. It's also very interesting, you know, you sometimes hear people and they're like, I thought I was European, that my family came straight from Europe to America. And I realized I did 23andMe and I'm, 10% Asian and I'm 9% African. And right, I had no ideas. And that kind of, opens up sort of perspectives on the diversity and the movement of humanity. And oftentimes in Jewish communities, the sort of thinking goes the other way around, right? We kind of want to find really what is common between us, what has always been common between us. Maybe that, one place where we all come from and that connects us all. And I'm not saying it's not true. I don't know. It may very well be true. But I think we also have to be you know, we have to recognize how much, and that is what culture is, right? Culture is also influenced by the society in which we live in, by the things we talk about, by the right social media networks we are a part of, by the big debates that are current today. And one of them is about, right, is sort of a conflict over land, and that some people are trying to win by saying, no, but, we came here first. And like I said in my presentation, to me, this is fascinating. Um, Much of it may even be true, but I think it's fundamentally information about the present. And as a historian, if I want to know things about how people lived and who they were in the past, what I need to do is to get as close as possible to them, what they wrote, what they left us, their own bodies. And my understanding, and I realize that we don't yet have enough ancient DNA to know, what did people, look like genetically in the Middle East and so on. But consistently, I think geneticists have been surprised when they looked at ancient DNA, right? Because they realized that that DNA that they studied from 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years ago, in fact, were a combination of groups that came before them, right? Not of groups that came after them. And so this is where I think my perspective is, if what I want to know about Jews, I need to really go there in the past. And all questions that start from the present, I'm fascinated. I'm part of this discussion myself, but at the same time, I'm not sure what exactly it tells us about culture in the past. So that would be my reaction.
Yeah, so Leo and Josh, what periods of history do you think genetic research can shed the most light on?
I think that when we start digging into the modern genomes of people, uh, and this is something I was trying to communicate in my presentation, is that what often comes up is the discovery of um, antique, that is to say, like classical Roman, let's say, period in the West, and medieval period uh, common ancestors between Jews from the same community or different communities. And it's really zooming in on the importance of certain antique and medieval communities as being the ancestors of multiple different modern communities which exist today. And I don't think, for example, that it's intuitive for modern people who are connected to, I guess, like modern Jewish linguistic and cultural spaces where we might use Ashkenazi as different from Sephardic and Mizrahi, which is together. But our genetic testing reveals that Sephardim, that is to say, like the descendants of Jews who left medieval Spain, they are much more closely related to Ashkenazi Jews than they are to any Mizrahi Jewish community. And the way that they are related is from these antique and early medieval common ancestor communities.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight. I mean, I really appreciate your comment, Flora, and I think there are still so many lacunae that only ancient DNA will be able to fill in, but not just ancient DNA, of course, because DNA itself can't speak, can't tell you the content of culture and history. Um, but what I was going to say is the period that Leo is pointing to, that we've actually spent a lot of time on in our investigations, appears to be, and it's not specific to Jewish history, but appears to be one of the most poorly documented periods in Jewish history, particularly um, west of uh, the land of Israel. Uh, we know very little after in the last few centuries of the Roman Empire. The bridge between that and the earliest appearance, for example, of Jews in the Rhineland or Jews in a recognizably medieval Sephardic culture and societal structure. So being able to at least create a bridgehead between two better documented periods using genetic evidence, I think has been an incredible accomplishment. I'll also point to so much ink has been spilled about the biblical period and the degree to which archaeology aligns with or doesn't align with biblical textual uh, claims, and also later periods in antique Judea. Um, and I think something that's really interesting, and an investigation that I keep mentioning I'm part of, is this story of the genetic legacy of Kohanim and the fact that there really is robust evidence in sort of this binary way, either there is or there isn't relatedness on the Y chromosome, that indicates that most Kohanim, not an overwhelming majority, but most men in Jewish communities who identify as having a Kohen tradition really do belong to, there's one main cluster, but say three or four clusters that seem to be associated with Kohen status going back to ancient times. And that seems to suggest that at least in the last 2,500 years, there have been no major lapses in the sense that this was a culturally significant status. And the specifics of that have evolved, and certainly in the transition from temple-based Judaism to a rabbinic system where the role of Kohanim has mostly been relegated to a few synagogue tasks. It seems to me that there's pretty robust evidence that perhaps only the genetics of modern people could have put an emphasis on for the persistence of that tradition in an objective generation to generation way. And if you look on an even more granular level, which comes up in the preprint of mine and Leo's and Dr. Karl Skoretsky's, I think there's also evidence in the tree structure of the largest Kohen branch for the fact that Kohanim during the Persian and Hellenistic period seem, according to historians, and also in ways that modern Jews' DNA reflects, seem to have become the all-purpose elite of Judean ancestry after the ruling class of the Davidic dynasty lost its preeminence in the Babylonian exile. So you can get really interesting and speculative and offer, I think, elucidation about very distant time periods using evidence from these tools. Sorry, I rambled
Yeah,
a
yeah,
bit.
no, no, and that's all fascinating, and I want to say, it's great work, and I'm not, denying that it certainly tells us something, right, about how Jews understood themselves and who they are over the centuries, and that those kind of right, I guess lines mattered and were important in how things were transmitted. The only thing I was trying to say is to also caution to kind of be careful between questions that come from the present and questions that are about the past. And that was really the point, I was trying to make coming from a historian's perspective. And in my piece, I give the example of the Khazar theory that emerged. I think, in the 19th century, when a Russian Jew wanted to show that, right, the origins of European Jews were actually Eastern European and not Western European. And then he came up with that theory. And today people are trying to look at right genes to kind of prove, well, you see, those Eastern European Jews are really from Poland or from Ukraine and not actually right from the Middle East or something like that. And when you look at how that emerged, well, in the 19th century, it emerged to answer a question that mattered to people at the time. And today it sort of is used to answer another question. And we have not learned much actually about the people in the past, right? We've learned about the questions that mattered to those who initiated those studies and ideas. And that's where, and look, I myself, I'm also driven by my own questions, and we all are. But to me, I still want to hold out to, I think modern DNA surely can show a lot. And the more we know and the more we study, the more it will show. But if you really want to know about people in the past, I think it's their own DNA that will be, I think, the most illuminating.
Thank you. Well, I'm seeing so many similarities between genetic research and linguistic and onomastic research, research on languages and names. And we'll talk about that more in our next seminar. But I just want to bring in one related thing, which is that both of them are very political, that no matter what you research, there are going to be contemporary political implications. And studying the past is very much about informing our understanding of community and identity in the present. I want to ask about the distinction between Sephardi and Ashkenazi. And Leo, in your presentation, you talked about Eastern versus Western as an umbrella term based on the similarities among different groups. And I'm wondering, I mean, these labels are very much socially constructed, and the emphasis on Sephardi versus Ashkenazi, even used for communities that are not descended from ancestors in Spain, shows that it has to do a lot with the rite, the nusach that is used. And so I'm wondering if you're suggesting, Leo, that we replace those labels Sephardi and Ashkenazi with Eastern versus Western.
That's a good question. So I think if I could make a suggestion for how we change the way we frame these terms, and these groups, it would be that there is a difference between one's rights or their community's right, their nusach, and then their ancestry, and that some rights found success beyond the actual descendants of the people who innovated those rights. And so, for example, today there are people of many different Jewish backgrounds that are practicing a form of Judaism which was innovated by Ashkenazi Jews, basically. And their nusach is some kind of Ashkenazi nusach, but their ancestral background may not be that. And so there's that concept, which is that descent from historical Jewish groups which had their own right is not the same as practicing the right of that was innovated by a certain historical group. And then there's the ancestral side, which I am inferring seems to show that Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, that is to say, those descendants of people who actually came from medieval Spain, they were related to each other in a way that implies like descent from specific late antique, early medieval communities, probably in Western, Central, Southern Europe, that are ancestral to both of these communities. And that when we're talking about deep ancestry, when we're talking about genealogy, we're talking about history, it's important to understand that Moroccan Jews are so much more closely related to Ashkenazi Jews than either is to a Mizrahi Jew. And that a Bukharian Jew and a Mountain Jew are so much more closely related to each other than either is to either or any Western Jewish group. So there's these core structures. You can think of them as like main branches of the Jewish family tree that shouldn't be violated because they're super important in terms of deep genealogy, but they don't always line up perfectly with how Jewish culture and the rights that cemented around those traits of culture, traversed communities over time and space.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of mutual influence among groups, right? And you get not just in right, but in culture, in music, in language, and all other aspects of culture. But you talked about here. I'm going to just read a quote. You said culture and genetic repertoires evolve together, and I think that's true to some extent. But culture can evolve much faster, especially after a rupture, like a migration, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If after a migration, you're not going to immediately get changes in the genetic makeup until there's intermingling of the populations in terms of having children together. Is that accurate?
Sure. I mean, you would say depends on the sample, what population you sample. So if like I'm sampling a mixed congregation whose unique cultural traits haven't like leveled out into like a common shared pool, then I'm also going to be sampling their different ancestries. So I think that the main idea that they evolve side by side is still valid, but of course, like certain aspects will be faster or slower than others depending on the context.
Well, and that actually makes me wonder about the testing that you do. You talked about having some new populations that you have data on because you've reached out to them and gotten tests for them. Is that, when you do that, do you make sure that the people you test are pure in terms of just having ancestry from one of these ancestral groups?
So ideally, if we were sampling their full genome ancestries or their autosomal ancestry, it would be best to sample people who are representatives, like unmixed representatives of these groups. It's not something that we've mentioned here, but there's a heritage preservation aspect of that idea, which goes like historical Jewish communities and their diversity, it's disappearing in the modern era. and that there's only some people who still survive today who are actually unmixed representatives of these historical communities. So they are special. But in the context of the work that my foundation has done thus far, it's been focused on Y chromosome testing. So we do validate the genealogical roots of testers' paternal lines, but aren't yet going too deeply into their full genealogies.
I'd also like to make a related point here, which is that we've been talking about different groups in sort of the cleanest, most stylized way possible. But for example, Leo has made some references to Eastern Sephardic Jews, Jews from the Ottoman Balkan realm who identify as Sephardic, whose recent ancestors tended to speak Ladino, etc. But as we know, this group, based on many threads of evidence, which actually Alexander Bader speaks to very well, represent an amalgam, a hodgepodge within the last few hundred years of Jewish ancestry from different parts of the Mediterranean and even some Ashkenazi ancestry too. And so actually when we test certain groups, we turn up interesting surprises. Jews who identify as Romaniot, which is a small group of pre-Sephardic Jews in Greece who are near and dear to my heart, who are often thought of as a relic group, as a relic, unadmixed pre-Sephardic group, are actually not that. We've learned that we see in contemporary times how people's identities and cultural performances are fluid, but we've also found ways in which the genetics of people indicate that has always been the story. And there's ancestry from Iberian Jews in pure, pristine, unadmixed Judeo-Greek speaking Romaniotes. I'm speaking in inverted commas, of course. So I think it's worth noting that we are often surprised, and we don't think of any of these groups as pristine units. We do try to look for people who are as genealogically comprised of ancestry from the same recent group as possible, but with the knowledge that all Jewish diaspora groups are ultimately composites of earlier groups, and is actually the most interesting takeaway Leo and I thought of the Erfurt study on Ashkenazi Jews that we participated in.
Okay, we have many questions from the audience. One of them is about statistical probability within a particular group that they have common ancestors versus, and also variation within particular groups. For example, within Ashkenazi communities, our tests might just say 99.9% Ashkenazi, but it doesn't give us more information than that, like Litvak versus Galicianer, et cetera. So can you say a little something about that?
Yeah, so there are ways that modern genetic tests do speak to subgroups of, let's say, Ashkenazi ancestry, like Litvaks and Galicianers. In 23andMe, this is called genetic communities. And on Ancestry DNA, this is referred to as ancestral journeys, I believe. And these are clusters based on IBD segment sharing, which show that basically Litvaks are slightly more closely related to other Litvaks, and Galicianers are slightly more closely related to other Galicianers within the network of Eastern Ashkenazi Jews who are closely linked in general. And that if you test it at one of these sites and you do have a lot of ancestry from a specific regional group, you probably do belong to a genetic cluster that is actually linked with these historical groups. In terms of the statistical probability that communities actually share ancestors, it sharing needs to just be defined into a time frame, and so the time frame is what we have a statistical probability for. But the sharing is absolutely real. It's undeniable that they have shared ancestors, and then we try to use the differences, the small mutational differences on the Y chromosome in this context, to infer when the common ancestors between those people lived. But that there is sharing is completely clear.
Okay, does you mentioned the Kohanim markers? Do Levi'im also have markers?
Oh, this is a great question. There is no Levite Y-DNA signature that is shared broadly across many Jewish diaspora groups. The most famous Levite marker, which is defining of 2/3 of Ashkenazi Levites, which is pretty substantial, is, as far as we know today, limited to Ashkenazi Levites. There is one lineage we know of that is found in Greek and Moroccan and Turkish Jews and some Eastern Ashkenazi Jews. Well, actually, the Greeks don't identify as Levite, but all the others do. But that pedigree, that Levite pedigree, isn't clear past about 1,500 years ago, versus a lot of these Cohen lineages span very disparate Jewish diaspora communities, and certainly the two or three most prominent seem to coalesce to a common ancestor who was very likely Jewish and likely of priestly origin in some period before the Common Era. There's nothing comparable among Levites, and there are multiple possible explanations for that. But what I will say is, if we haven't found it at this point, it's not there. We may find, for example, that the Ashkenazi Levite branch shares a root with Mizrahi Levite, and their common ancestry dates back 2,500 years ago, and that would be a bombshell. But there is nothing comparable to what we find among Kohanim.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time. I want to just wrap up by saying a few things. First of all, we have several other questions that will be answered in the next webinar in this series, including Alexander Bader's questions. Alexander Bader, Sasha, you will get all of your questions answered next time when you are a panelist. And that includes a lot of questions about what about other groups that you didn't mention, that Leo didn't mention in his presentation. Really quick, Leo, if someone wants to get a test from the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, how can they do that?
So I would ask you to contact us. We've got a contact form on our website. It's jewishgeneticdiscovery.org, and we can type that in the chat as well. Currently, we're looking to test people not of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. The reason why is because many tens of thousands of Ashkenazi Jews have already done genetic testing in the form that we're looking at, and so we're seeking to address underrepresentation from other Jewish groups. And so, for the limited funding that we do have, we're using that on these other Jewish groups. So if you happen to have a non-Ashkenazi Jewish background, you're interested in your deep ancestry, and you'd like to help us solve some more Jewish history, then please contact us via our website.
Thank you. And thank you to our panelists, Flora, Leo, and Josh, for this wonderful conversation. I'm going to just thank our sponsors right now by sharing my screen and showing you who they are. And so I would like to thank our sponsors, the HUC Jewish Language Project, American Sephardi Federation, ANU Museum of the Jewish People, HUC Connect, International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, Jewish Gen, Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, Northeastern University's Jewish Migration Project, Jewish Unity Through Diversity, the Yiddish Book Center, SAMI, Sephardi American Mizrahi Initiative, and the Sephardi Mizrahi Q Network. Please join us for the last panel in this series on Sunday, March 15th. at the same time in some time zones, different time in Europe and Israel, I believe. And that is going to focus on the interplay between genetics and linguistic and onomastic research in understanding Jewish migration and settlement patterns. We'll have Alexander Bader and Leo Cooper again, and another colleague from the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, Jeremy Kodliar. And there are many ways that you can get involved. You can talk about these issues of genetics and language and ancestry in your synagogues, schools, organizations. I recommend using Shoresh Maps, that amazing mapping service that we introduced last week, and talking about heritage words, the words we've inherited from our ancestors in our organizations and communities. We also have a curriculum called Beyond the Family Tree, Jewish History and Diversity Through Family Languages and Names. And we have a wonderful podcast called Heritage Words. You can follow the Jewish Language Project and our co-sponsors on social media. Stay tuned for our big announcement of our upcoming study tours. And we always welcome financial donations and contributions to an endowment. Thank you so much for joining us today.